In 1973, forgotten by history, more than 120 descendants of richest man in 19th century America gathered at a reunion in Vanderbilt, Rhode Island. Not one of them was a millionaire. The family that once controlled more money than the United States Treasury itself couldn't produce a single person worth 7 figures. This is the story of how a fortune the size of a small nation's economy simply vanished. Cold open, the question, how do you lose $200? Not through a single bad decision, not through one catastrophic crash, not even through fraud, scandal, or war. The Vanderbilt fortune didn't collapse. It evaporated slowly, deliberately, across 3 generations, while the family that built it stood by and let it happen. Some of them, in fact, helped it happen, 1 mansion, 1 yacht, 1 ball at a time. This isn't a story about bad luck. It's a story about what happens when wealth outlives the discipline that created it. And by the end, you'll understand why so many of history's great fortunes, from oil barons to tech billionaires, fear the same quiet, invisible collapse. Let's go back to where it started. On a small ferry on the waters of New York Harbor in the year 1810. Section 1. The Rise. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he was 11 years old when he informed his mother that school no longer interested him. He wanted the water. Born in 1794 on Staten Island to a modest family of Dutch descent, Vanderbilt had no formal education worth mentioning, no inheritance, and no connections. What he had was an appetite for risk that bordered on obsession, and an instinct for transportation that would, decades later, be recognized as genius. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small boat, promising to repay her by year's end, with interest. He did ahead of schedule. That boat became a ferry business. The ferry business became a fleet. By his 30s, Vanderbilt controlled steamboat routes across the northeastern United States, undercutting competitors so aggressively that rivals sometimes paid him simply to leave their markets alone. He earned the nickname Commodore, a title with no official military meaning, but one that stuck because it fit. He acted like a man who owned the water. Here's the part most people miss. Vanderbilt made his first fortune in shipping. Then, in his 60s, at an age when most successful men of his era were already retiring, he did something almost nobody expected. He looked at the emerging railroad industry, recognized that steam-powered rail would soon replace steam-powered ships as the backbone of American commerce, and pivoted his entire empire. Think about that a second. Imagine the wealthiest man in shipping today deciding in his 60s to bet everything on an entirely new industry and winning bigger than he ever had before. That's exactly what Vanderbilt did. He began quietly acquiring railroad stock, eventually consolidating control over the New York Central Railroad and linking it to other lines, creating one of the first true transportation monopolies in American history. By the time of his death in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had amassed a fortune estimated at over $100 million. A figure that, adjusted for the scale of the American economy at the time, made him arguably the richest man in the country's history to that point. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The empire wasn't just about to peak, it was about to explode into something even larger. And the man who would take it there was someone Cornelius almost didn't trust with the job. Mini cliffhanger. Because the old Commodore had 13 children, and when it came time to choose an heir, he was about to make a decision that would either build the greatest fortune in American history or destroy it before it even began. Section 2. The Peak. Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't believe in dividing his fortune equally. He believed in concentration, putting the empire into the hands of one person capable of protecting it. That person was his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. It's a decision worth pausing on. Of 13 children, Cornelius left roughly 95% of his fortune to William alone. The rest of the family received comparatively modest sums, enormous by ordinary standards, but a fraction of the whole. Cornelius wanted one steward, not 11 competing heirs. William proved, at least initially, that his father's judgment was sound. In the 8 years he controlled the family empire, from 1877 to his death in 1885, William didn't just preserve the Vanderbilt fortune. He doubled it. By the time he died, the family's wealth was estimated at roughly $200 million, making the Vanderbilts almost certainly the wealthiest family in the United States, and among the wealthiest in the world. To put that in perspective, at its peak, the Vanderbilt is estimated by some historians to have been comparable, in economic terms, to $100 billion in modern terms. Some estimates run even higher, rivaling the net worth of today's biggest tech billionaires, at a time when the entire U.S. economy was a fraction of its current size. This was a family that literally could have purchased large portions of the American economy outright. And they wanted the world to know it. Beginning in the 1880s and accelerating through the following decades, the Vanderbilts began constructing a series of mansions so extravagant they redefined what wealth looked like in America. Along Fifth Avenue in New York, Vanderbilt residences rose one after another. French Renaissance transplanted it into Manhattan, built not just to house families but to announce dominance. In Newport, Rhode Island, the family built summer cottages, a term that meant, in Vanderbilt language, 70-room limestone palaces like the Breakers, completed in 1895, modeled on Italian Renaissance palazzos and requiring a small army of staff simply to maintain. And then Biltmore. Built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, William's youngest son, Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina remains, to this day, the largest owned house in the United States, nearly 179,000 square feet, with 250 rooms, sitting on tens of thousands of acres of land. Construction alone is estimated to have cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. By the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt name had become shorthand for American aristocracy itself, a family that had gone from a single rowboat on Staten Island to owning, by some estimates, more wealth than the entire United States federal government held in its treasury. It seemed unstoppable. But underneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings, something was already going wrong. And it had nothing to do with the railroads, the stock market, or the economy. Mini cliffhanger. It had to do with a decision Cornelius Vanderbilt made on purpose, a decision his descendants would spend the next 100 years reversing, mansion by mansion, dollar by dollar. Section 3. The Hidden Weakness. Here's the metaphor worth remembering for the rest of this story. Think of a fortune like a reservoir, and each generation like a series of pipes. Cornelius built the reservoir. William maintained pressure. But every generation after him opened new pipes. Mansions, yachts, parties, divorces, inheritances split further and further apart, without ever building a new source of water flowing in. A fortune isn't just a number, it's rate. And once the rate of spending exceeds the rate of earning, no fortune, no matter how large, survives contact with time. The Vanderbilts had two structural weaknesses baked into their success from the very beginning. The first was concentration followed by fragmentation. Cornelius deliberately kept the fortune whole by handing it almost entirely to one heir. But William did not follow the same philosophy. When William died in 1885, he split his fortune among his children, a natural, humane decision, but one that meant the family capital, once a single unstoppable force, was now divided into multiple large, but individually smaller rivers. And each of those rivers, in turn, be divided again by the next generation, and again by the one after that. Do the math on that pattern. Divide a fortune in half every generation, and after just 5 generations, each heir holds roughly 3% of the original wealth, even before accounting for spending, taxes, or bad investments. Fragmentation alone is enough to dissolve a dynasty, given enough time. The second weakness was cultural, not mathematical. The Vanderbilts built an identity around visible consumption rather than continued enterprise. Cornelius and William made their money building things: ships, railroads, infrastructure that generated ongoing income. Their descendants, for the most part, didn't build anything. They spent. Mansions that cost fortunes to build also cost fortunes to maintain. Staff, taxes, upkeep, every single year, whether the family was earning new income or not. Alva Vanderbilt, William's daughter-in-law, once spent an estimated $50,000, a staggering sum in 1883, on a single costume ball at her new Fifth Avenue mansion, an event extravagant. It was designed specifically to force New York's old money elite, who had previously snubbed the Vanderbilts as new money, to finally accept them into high society. It worked. The Vanderbilts got their social acceptance. But it also revealed something important. For this family, wealth was increasingly becoming a tool for status, not a foundation for continued growth. And status, unlike a railroad, doesn't generate income. It only consumes it. By the 1890s, cracks were already visible to anyone paying close attention. Several Vanderbilt heirs were living far beyond even their considerable means. Divorces, expensive, scandalous, and increasingly frequent, began fracturing family alliances and family capital simultaneously. And the railroads themselves, once the unassailable engine of American commerce, were entering a period of intensifying competition, regulation, and, eventually, decline as automobiles and highways began reshaping American transportation in the 20th century. The family that had built its fortune anticipating the future, ironically, about to be caught flat-footed by it, mini cliffhanger. And the moment that revealed just how deep the rot had gone wouldn't come from a stock market crash, or a lawsuit, or a scandal in the papers. It would come from a single dinner party, one where the entire fortune and the family's blindness to its own decline was laid bare for the world to see. Section 4. The Turning Point. The date historians point to as the symbolic peak and the beginning of the end is 1897. That year, Cornelius Vanderbilt's son, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, and other family members hosted a series of parties so extravagant they became legendary even by Gilded Age standards. The most infamous, the Bradley Martin Ball, hosted by family friends and imitators of Vanderbilt-style excess, reportedly cost the equivalent of several $100,000 in a single night, during a period of serious economic hardship for much of the country following the Panic of 1893. Public backlash was immediate and severe. Newspapers, once fascinated by Vanderbilt wealth, began openly criticizing the family's spending as tone-deaf and excessive. It was the first real crack in the armor of public admiration the Vanderbilts had spent decades building. But the real turning point wasn't public opinion. It was internal. As the 20th century progressed, the family's core asset, the New York Central Railroad system, along with related rail holdings, began facing serious structural pressure. Railroads required constant reinvestment, track maintenance, equipment upgrades, competition with new rail lines, and eventually competition from an entirely new form of transportation nobody in Cornelius's generation could have fully anticipated: the automobile and later commercial aviation. Meanwhile, the family that had once obsessively reinvested in its core business had, by the third and fourth generations, largely stopped thinking like operators and started thinking like heirs. Rather than expanding the railroad empire or diversifying aggressively into new industries the way contemporaries like the Rockefellers or the Mellons did, many Vanderbilt descendants focused their energy on maintaining social status, managing already built estates, and living off dividends from a shrinking asset base. It's worth comparing this directly to a family that made the opposite choice. The Rockefeller family, whose fortune from Standard Oil rivaled and even exceeded Vanderbilt wealth at its peak, took a fundamentally different approach in the 20th century. Rather than concentrating on visible consumption, the Rockefellers built structures designed explicitly to preserve wealth across generations: trusts, foundations, and a family office system that professionalized wealth management long before it became standard practice. The Rockefeller family, while its individual members are no longer among the world's very richest, remains prominent, influential, and financially secure generations later. The Vanderbilts built no equivalent structure. There was no unifying family office, no coordinated investment strategy, no long-term institutional mechanism to protect the fortune from the natural pressures of division, taxation, and time. Each branch of the family, essentially, was left to sink or swim on its own. And by the early 20th century, more and more branches were sinking. Mini cliffhanger. The estates kept getting built. The parties kept getting thrown. But the pipes feeding the reservoir had already run dry, and almost nobody in the family seemed to notice, until it was far too late to reverse. Section 5. The Collapse. There was no single dramatic crash. No headline that read "Vanderbilt fortune wiped out." That's precisely what makes this story so unsettling. The decline was gradual enough that no single generation felt fully responsible for it. By the 1920s and 1930s, several branches of the Vanderbilt family were already struggling to maintain their properties. Mansions that had cost millions to build and required enormous annual sums simply to staff and heat became financial burdens rather than assets. Property taxes rose. Domestic staff, once numbering in the dozens per household, became unaffordable. One by one, the great Fifth Avenue mansions, the very houses built to announce the Vanderbilts' permanence, were sold, demolished, or converted into commercial buildings. Today, almost none of the original Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue still stand as private residences. Where fortresses of marble once lined Manhattan's most prestigious avenue, you'll now find office buildings, retail stores, and apartment towers. Biltmore Estate, too extraordinary and too expensive to maintain privately, was gradually opened to the public as a tourist attraction beginning in 1930. A decision made not purely out of generosity, but out of financial necessity. The family needed income, and Biltmore, once a monument to private wealth, became instead a business open to anyone who could buy a ticket. The Great Depression accelerated everything. Family members who had inherited already diminished shares of the original fortune saw investments falter, income streams shrink, and the cost of maintaining Gilded Age lifestyles become unsustainable. By the time we reach that 1983 family reunion, the one mentioned at the very beginning of this documentary, the numbers tell the full story with brutal clarity. Roughly 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered together, and by that point, journalist and family biographer Arthur T. Vanderbilt Sue, who researched the family extensively, confirmed that not a single one of them was a millionaire. Let that sink in. A fortune that had once been comparable, in relative terms, to well over $100 billion. A fortune so large it likely exceeded the entire net worth of the United States government at one point in the 19th century, had, within roughly 90 years, spent and dissolved so completely that not one direct descendant remained among even the modestly wealthy. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't lost in a crash. It was simply spent, divided, and never replenished, generation after generation, until there was nothing left to divide. Fanger. But here's the strange, almost poetic twist. While the money disappeared, the name never did. And what the Vanderbilts left behind may be more than the fortune ever was. Section 6. The Legacy. Walk through Newport, Rhode Island today, and you'll still see the breakers, standing exactly where it always has, but it's no longer a private residence. It's a museum, operated by the Preservation Society of Newport County, visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists every year. Walk through Asheville, North Carolina, and Biltmore Estate still stands too, now one of the most visited private tourist attractions in the United States, drawing over 1 million visitors annually and generating meaningful revenue not for a single wealthy family, but as an operating business employing thousands of people. The physical monuments to Vanderbilt wealth didn't disappear. They transformed from symbols of private dominance into public heritage, preserved specifically because the family could no longer afford to keep them as private trophies. And the name itself endures in a completely different way. Anderson Cooper, the CNN journalist, is a direct descendant of Cornelius Vanderbilt. His mother, the artist and designer Gloria Vanderbilt, was herself a Vanderbilt heir who built her own independent career and fortune, notably through her own fashion and denim business rather than inherited railroad money. Cooper has spoken publicly and candidly about growing up without access to old Vanderbilt wealth, and about his mother's decision not to leave him a significant inheritance, a striking, almost symbolic echo of the very dynamics that dissolved the original generations earlier. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, founded through an 1873 donation from Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, still carries the family name and remains one of the most respected universities in the United States. Arguably one of the most durable pieces of the Vanderbilt legacy, because it wasn't structured as personal wealth to be divided. It was structured as an institution. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. The parts of the Vanderbilt legacy that survived weren't the ones designed to enrich individual descendants. They were the ones designed to serve something larger than any one person. A university, a museum, a public landmark. Everything built purely for private glorification eventually had to be sold, opened to the public, or lost. Everything built as genuine institution endured. Cliffhanger. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a moment. If the richest family in 19th century America couldn't preserve its fortune past 3 generations, What chance does any billionaire family today actually have? Section 7. The comparison and the lesson. There's a well-known saying, often summarized, Shirtsleeves to Shirtsleeves in 3 generations. The idea that the first generation builds wealth, the second maintains it, and the third loses it. Researchers who study family wealth across generations have found this pattern remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries, not just in America, but around the world. Some studies on family wealth transfer suggest a majority of family fortunes are substantially diminished or gone entirely by the 3rd generation, and the overwhelming majority are gone by the 4th. The Vanderbilts didn't defy that pattern. They became one of its most extreme, most well-documented examples. Compare this again to the Rockefellers, who took deliberate structural steps: trusts, foundations, professionalized family governance, specifically to interrupt that pattern. Compare it to families like the Waltons of Walmart, who have worked to keep controlling ownership centered rather than fragmented, or modern billionaires like Warren Buffett, who has spoken openly about giving his children enough to do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. A philosophy seemingly built as a direct rebuttal to exactly the kind of unstructured, unlimited inheritance the Vanderbilts practiced. The lesson isn't that wealth itself is dangerous. It's that wealth without a structure to preserve it is inherently temporary, no matter how large it starts out. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his fortune on a simple, almost brutal discipline: reinvest, expand, dominate, repeat. His descendants, for the most part, replaced that discipline with display, a belief that having money and looking like you had money were the same thing. They weren't. And the gap between those two things is exactly where a $200 billion fortune quietly disappeared. Closing the callback. Let's return to that reunion in 1973. 120 descendants of the richest man in 19th century America standing together, none of them a millionaire. It's tempting to call that a tragedy. In some ways, it is. But it's also something more instructive than tragic. It's proof that no fortune, no matter how vast, survives on size alone. It survives on structure, discipline, and purpose. The Vanderbilts had the first in overwhelming abundance. They never fully built the other two. The money, gone. But walk through the breakers, walk through Biltmore, walk across Vanderbilt University's campus, and you'll realize the family didn't disappear at all. They just stopped owning the empire and started belonging to history instead. Teaser, next video. But the Vanderbilts weren't the only Gilded Age dynasty to build an empire that seemed untouchable. Because there was another family, one that didn't just build railroads or mansions, but quietly came to control nearly 90% of an entire industry America couldn't survive without. A family so powerful the United States government eventually took the unprecedented step of breaking their empire apart by federal law. Their name was Rockefeller, and unlike Vanderbilt's, they saw the collapse coming decades before it happened. That story, and how one family engineered the exact opposite ending, is next.